Salil Tripathi is a London-based author of 3 works of non-fiction. He chairs PEN International's Writers in Prison Committee. So, Salil, over to you.
Let me introduce the other 2 panelists. I have to my immediate right Susan McKay, who doesn't need an introduction here or in the human rights world, distinguished writer who makes Ireland and its stories accessible and understood to us outside. Navtej is a distinguished diplomat and a writer. He has been a translator. He has written fiction, non-fiction. And to my far right, which is not a political comment, trust me, is Garrett Carr, who has written very movingly, very thought-provokingly about the border. So Garrett, I wanted to start with you, that very often the walls and borders are in our minds, and you talk about that in your book. We make of borders what we wish to make, is another theme that occurs in your writing. This has been a divided city. We are in one. And further south, there were watchtowers and guards with guns, looking either for alcohol or looking for weapons in some time. Now, as you describe so well in your book, a new border might emerge. I live in London. Brexit conversation grips us all the time. You walked along the border. What have you found?
I suppose at the beginning, I was kind of, I decided I was going to follow the border from east to west, and I was doing it so you wouldn't have to. I was kind of going to go check this place out so I could, but I wanted to try and represent it in some way. And I felt that in order to earn the right to do so, I would have to follow it very closely and see it with my own eyes. It was about a kind of earning the right to represent it. I grew up near to the border as well, which is also part of that. So, and I felt it was a good time. The word Brexit didn't exist when I started this. But all the same, I don't think it's a complete coincidence, because there was something on the rise there, something that we've seen emerge even more strongly now, not just in the UK, but in the United States and in India, indeed. Nationalism, ethno-nationalism sort of re-emerging, and I think you could sort of detect it. And of course UKIP did exist, and claiming control of our borders was sort of a kind of a conversation. So I think that's what was going on. But I was thinking about how if you actually go walk the border, you discover it's actually open country. So what people are responding to, the border in the minds to some extent, is the symbol on the map, you know, this black line on the map, which looks quite serious. But then if you go there, it's actually just fields and streams and hedgerows. And so I thought if people actually reacted, if people actually held that what the border actually looked like in their minds instead of the symbol on the map, then that might be a more productive sort of thing to do. And it was kind of an optimistic project in some way. It was, you know, a sort of post-Good Friday Agreement thing to try and take on, to go back to the border and think of it as a place rather than a problem, as a landscape rather than just a sort of a tactical issue. And so that's what sent me going. What did I find? Well, as I mentioned, I thought it was the kind of the place that only a travel writer would really be concerned with. But actually, in fact, one thing that surprised me is actually the beauty of it and how many really beautiful stretches there are and sort of underexplored. Take around the Earn system from Mana, for example. I think if it wasn't for the Troubles, there'd probably be about 5 hotels there, you know. But instead, people have tended to shun it, and it's actually preserved it in a way. And another thing I found was that it was a bit of a place unto itself. And this is something that kind of occurred to me about halfway along the line, because people were sort of orientating themselves via the border. They talked about how far they lived from the border. And I started to feel like there was actually this other culture there between the north and south. So the border hadn't actually divided Ireland into 2. It had actually divided into 3 parts: the north, the south, and this third thing, the borderland. And you kind of felt like, I felt like I was exploring this sort of new country.
Navtej, I want to talk to you about borders as well, of course. You've written harrowing accounts in your translations about what had happened when a border was created in people's minds and hearts, and how the land had been irrigated with blood. One scene I recall, which is from the other border between India and what used to be East Pakistan, but now Bangladesh, is from a film by Ritwik Ghatak called Komal Gandhar, which is E-flat, where the camera zooms towards the horizon and suddenly it stops as it reaches the end of the track, like a train suddenly halting. And you can feel the piercing cry, and a different nation and a different reality begins. The borders he spoke about were cultural in Tagore's case and so on, and formed by the field or a pond, but not fences, not watchtowers, not checkpoints, not sentries. And the whole drama at Wagah, we are all familiar with, between India and Pakistan, and the suddenness of the borders. Would you like to?
Well, thanks, Salil. I think hearing a description of the border in Ireland, or the lack of it, I think it's a very unique situation because, to my mind, borders are always scary places. And they've been, they are frightening places, they are well-guarded places, and I'm not only talking of the India-Pakistan border, which of course is a very heavily fortified border. And, if you ever fly over on the way to Delhi at night you can just look out and you'll see the border. You'll see miles and miles of it is got a line of very bright electric lights. So you know where the subcontinent was torn asunder. And borders both of you talked of Germany. I've traveled in the old days from Soviet Moscow to Paris, and the border when you crossed from East Germany to West Germany was very scary. You were woken up in the middle of the night, and there were German shepherds looking for people under the train, and there were electricity closets were being opened out to make sure that nobody was hiding in them. So I think the borders can be normal places, but I think if they are, we should consider ourselves fortunate, because otherwise, where the borders have been drawn, and I think that's where you're looking at, where the borders have been drawn not willingly, or perhaps by a third country, or by a departing colonial power, as has happened not only in the India-Pakistan context, but you've seen it in Israel-Palestine, you've seen it in other places, you've seen it in the Sykes-Picot arrangements.
As well, yeah.
And these are lines which are actually drawn without much thought. They've been drawn across communities, they've been drawn across people's hearts, and they leave very, very deep impact. So I think there are many facets of borders that we can discuss.
Do you want to tell the story about how quickly Radcliffe drew the line?
Well,
it's worth noting, given the scale of...
Well, once they were asked to, once it was decided that India would be partitioned, they brought in this British jurist, Sir Cyril Radcliffe, and the irony is that he had no idea of India. He had never been to India before. And he sat sweating in the heat of August in India, and in 5 weeks, he drew the line and went away and never went back. And what he caused was complete havoc. There are 12 to 14 million, figures vary, but about 12 to 14 million people were displaced over a matter of weeks. 1 million people died. 75,000 women were abducted, raped, abandoned. And we haven't recovered since. I belong to a refugee family, if you can call it that, for people who left everything that they had and went across to the other side and started life all over again in very, very difficult circumstances. There was a huge program of rehabilitation, imperfect as only it can be given the numbers. So again, it was a line which nobody in his senses would have drawn. So it was drawn because the British wanted out. They wanted out quickly. The Second World War had brought down their ability to handle the empire, and they found this solution which was part of their creation, using the old divide and rule imperative of that Hindus and Muslims cannot stay together. So okay, let's partition this thing and let's get out. And Mountbatten promised that there would be no violence. He said that I'm a soldier, I'll take care of that. So there will be no violence. Nobody anticipated that populations would be transferring across the line, and not only in Punjab but in Bengal.
Yeah.
And of course, when it started happening, neither Mountbatten nor anybody else could control it.
Susan, you want to read first, right? I do have a question, but I'll come to that, yes.
Okay. I was going to read a piece which I wrote, which was published in the Irish Times just over a year ago, and when the Brexit debate was only beginning to get really nasty. And at that time I was living south of the border in Leitrim, which is a border county, but on the southern side of the border. So, a clever Channel 4 report has shown that the Brit on the street can't draw the Irish border. Some of them imagining it as a loose girdle draped about the waist of the island, rather than as the noose around its neck, which it more accurately resembles. Easy to scoff, but plenty of citizens in the Irish Republic are disinterested, ignorant, or even hostile when it comes to the jurisdiction that lies beyond that border, that bourne depicted by unionists with a mix of sentimentality and defensiveness as our wee country. In Dublin, the case is extreme. Eyes have long glazed over when the north is mentioned. Belfast is well beyond the pale. During the Troubles, anywhere north of Drogheda was for some up in the direction and to be avoided. But even now, even along the southern fringes of the border, a certain silence about it prevails, though thousands cross it every day. Right now, worried shopkeepers watch cars speed by as shoppers take advantage of the favourable exchange rate and head across to Derry, Newry, Enniskillen. A week ago, I walked the beach at Mullaghmore in County Sligo. An elderly man came down through the sandhills and set off towards the harbour. He had his hands clasped behind his back, holding a transistor radio, engrossed in listening to a discussion about Brexit and the border. It struck me that apart from anti-Brexit campaigners, he was one of the few people I have met since I came to work in this border region of the northwest of the Republic a year and a half ago, who appeared deeply interested in the issue, any issue about the north, actually. I said this to a friend from the area. She said people might have their own thoughts, but might not want to risk provoking a northerner by airing them in front of me. Maybe. The last time I lived in Sligo during the 1980s, there was a wariness of the northerner too, lest we might be carriers of the Troubles plague. North Sligo was known as Yeats Country. He wrote to Lady Gregory in the run-up to partition in 1921. I have long been of the opinion that if such a disagreeable people shut the door, we should turn the key in the lock before they change their mind. He would later accuse the Irish government of driving a wedge across the country with its conservative Catholic laws. Seamus Heaney wrote about how when he left the north for Wicklow during the early 1970s, a wood kern escaped from the fray. There used to be talk of our people up there. This dwindled as the IRA campaign intensified and collective shame grew. We spoke different languages. In Parable Island from his 1987 collection, Heaney wrote, "To find out where he stands, the traveller has to keep listening, since there is no map which draws the line he knows he must have crossed." The border was a deep wound. Murders that came to be regarded as shockingly normal in a village on the northern side would have been unthinkable half a mile away in the Republic. The peace process blurred it, removed the furniture of huts and forts, dragon's teeth and craters, opened things up. The customs men vanished. The soldiers went home. No more checkpoints, red torches signalling you to stop in the darkness. No more furtive journeys for smuggled sheep and chickens on unapproved roads. Nowadays they are brought on brisk legal journeys, all playing their allotted parts in global marketing systems. However, despite peace money, decades of economic neglect have left ruined towns and villages on both sides of the border. There's no government in the north. Now, with Brexit, old animosities are being rehearsed. Twitter is full of recriminations that seem to have had their day long before that medium was even invented. People in the Republic wince at the colloquial aggression coming from unionists, the Taoiseach told by a retired leader to wind his neck in, threats of fish wars. They are irritated by Northern nationalists' insistence upon laws to establish cultural equality. Mullaghmore is where in 1979 Lord Mountbatten and 4 other people were murdered by the IRA. A couple of years ago, when Prince Charles came to visit, he was warmly welcomed. But I noticed on the sign put up to mark the visit, which featured a smiling photo of the royal couple, the face of Charles had recently been gouged out. At a traditional music session in a Leitrim village last Friday night, the bloody ballad about the assassination by tenants in 1878 of the cruel Lord Leitrim was sung. A woman said to me as she was leaving, "Wasn't it great to hear the song about old Mountbatten getting his comeuppance?" The border has left an unhealed scar across the country that has begun with this Brexit business to open up again. So it's quite interesting that Mountbatten features again in relation to our border issues.
Yeah, that was what I thought too.
You couldn't stay away from them.
Yeah. Susan, I have a question for you which draws on something that Navtej referred to. He referred to the 75,000 women who were raped. And we have to bear in mind that these are stories from 1947. Rape is a very, very hard crime to report for the woman. So if there are 75,000 names or numbers, as we know, of that time, it must be at least 10 times as much or something like that. What must have actually happened is what I would guess. But given that borders are seen as inviolable, but nowhere more so than our own bodies, and I want to turn to that because of your work with the Rape Crisis Center. There's this poem by Imtiaz Dharkar. We were talking about it on email the other day. When the body becomes a territory, shifting across uneasy sheets, when you retreat behind the borderline of skin, turning, barbed wire sinking in, and then she goes on, because leaving home you call yourself free, because behind you barbed wire grows, where you once had planted a tree. As you've been writing about this issue, the inviolability of the body was completely disregarded during, it always is, I mean, it's not that conflict specific, but you have some harrowing stories that I read in your work. Tell us about that violence, about borders, and the whole idea of worshipping the motherland and protecting the father. It's become so genderized, the entire conversation.
Yeah, I mean, these are very big questions. It's interesting that in, George Bernard Shaw, I think, initiated it, the notion of John Bull's Other Island and the notion that Ireland was raped by Britain, the metaphor as rape as part of colonialisation. But in terms of the gender-based violence here, when I was involved in setting up the Rape Crisis Centre in Belfast, just a little bit of the personal background of that was I came from Derry, which is on the northern side of the border, and I grew up there during the worst part of the Troubles in the 1970s. So I kind of fled south of the border because I thought it was a place where nothing happened and it was all completely peaceful. I don't know how I managed to escape noticing that there had been bombs in the Republic as well, quite shortly before I moved there, but anyway, I did. But I soon discovered that you don't leave a conflicted country as easily as all that, and I decided to go back to the north. So I came back to Belfast in 1981, just after the hunger strikes had finished, and I felt that I couldn't fit in with the politics of the north, so the only thing that I could identify with was feminism, so I got involved with other women in setting up the Rape Crisis Centre. But we used to get people coming to us and saying, "Oh, can you introduce us to a Protestant woman who was raped by an IRA man?" Or
yes.
"Can you introduce us to a Catholic woman who was raped by a British soldier?" And what we in fact were finding was that that wasn't actually how it happened. Women were more being raped in the Northern Irish context within their own families and communities by the men who designated themselves as the defenders of those communities. And I think that that's an aspect of rape in warfare which is insufficiently recognised, is that men with guns who see themselves in a very macho role as defenders are quite often the exact opposite when it comes to women. And recently we saw a really striking thing happening in Derry when Lyra McKay, the journalist and writer, was murdered there 2 months ago. her women friends in Derry went up to these very, very militaristic, very macho, very penile murals of armed men with armalites and rocket launchers and so on. And they put their hands into red gloss paint representing the blood of Lyra, which had just been shed, and they placed their hands on this wall over this mural. And it was such a powerful gesture of just a women's peace protest. But yeah, I mean, there was all sorts of ways in which the violence here was gendered. It used to be known as the violence was understood to be the conflict between the IRA and the British Army and the Loyalists, but the other violence was the violence that I became interested in, which was violence against women and children.
Right.
And there were things like, for example, tarring and feathering.
Yes.
Which
You write
was,
very movingly about that, yes.
Well, it was just such a striking thing. This was if women had been seen to be fraternizing with British soldiers, which they often were, because there used to be dances and things which would be attended by British soldiers as well as by local people, and especially local women. And sometimes a woman would be made an example of, and her hair would be shorn off, and she would be tied to a railing, and tar or black paint would be poured over her head. And it was a very sexual, shaming thing. And it happened on the Loyalist side as well. And in fact, there was one woman at least who was beaten to death by Loyalists because she was seen to have broken sexual taboos by having an affair with the husband, or having an affair with a man after she came out of prison, because he was already married to somebody else. So, it was very gendered in ways that really feminists are only beginning to write about fully now, all this time later.
Right, yeah. Garrett, I want to come back to you about the need to guard physical borders, which is what nation states decide to do. What makes them worth protecting? Is it the idea of honor? Is it the idea of language? Is it the idea of faith? Is it identity? What kind of identity is this?
Just occurred to me, though, just with the context in which you're speaking here, that the violence, some of the violence that Susan was talking about there, actually would kind of fit into the honor-killing sort of mode.
Yeah.
In any case, what are they guarding? Well, today, of course, the border seems open. However, if the four of us were to get on a bus, you two would be questioned, and they'd want to see your passports. Where Susan and I, probably not. Or at least if we didn't have our passport, they'd just let us go on, whereas you guys would be sent back. So it is actually guarded, and it is a hard border for some of us. And what's being protected there? Well, that's about immigration control, and so that's going on. That's just worth remembering that that for some folks that the border is as hard now as it ever was. What's been protected in Ireland? Well, what's happened is we've had the Good Friday Agreement enabled us to move the conversation on a little bit, and those kind of distinctions have become blurred, and I think in ways that I think were very useful and important. So now it's a much more open space, representing a kind of a more open attitude on the island. And that, weirdly, I think that's worth defending. So the border is worth defending in that sense, but it's the kind of defense that occurs by leaving it open. But it's actually a very valuable thing. It's a real treasure, actually, to come up with. And it would have been, you couldn't really have written an agreement that would give you the recipe for that, I don't think. It took a kind of an act of will among all the islands people, really, and certainly in Northern Ireland. That's what I would like to see defended now, and I speak about it quite often because of the concern of Brexit. Because the kind of the Radcliffe line and the things you spoke about earlier, well, we kind of feel like there's a sort of a bit of a rerun of that attitude is occurring now, and it's extremely alarming and a little surprising that we seem to return to that kind of phase. On the border, obviously, when I was traveling it, and I still go back there quite often, talk to a lot of people, and I find younger folks, this is not a scientific survey now, but younger folks maybe aren't quite so concerned about Brexit, but they kind of feel, oh, it'll be fine, we'll manage, it'll be exchange rates, and even kind of see maybe there might be the odd opportunity about it. Although I don't, not too many people are in favour of such, but they can kind of see ways they can deal with it. They're a pretty resilient bunch in general. But then older people, I find, are much more, the kind of like stronger anxieties there. I think because they've seen how wrong things can go, and how quickly and how shockingly things can just sort of tip over, and how a soft border could become hard again, and it could just sort of happen while you're not looking. And maybe even a sort of a residual trauma, perhaps even, has been sort of reawoken there. One thing I have to say, though, as regards the partition of India and then Pakistan in 71, is we should remember that these things do put it all into context. And Northern Ireland's situation is really quite, it's very small in comparison. You did the sheer numbers and the extent of the violence in the partition of India is just, it's flabbergasting. And yet, kind of on the world scale, Ireland's border seems to get quite a lot of attention. It's completely out of proportion. I'm not entirely sure why that is, though I could probably make a few guesses. But we should think about the scale of things, and maybe even take our situation as an opportunity to be more generous to the rest of the world, rather than looking so inwardly. And one way we might go about doing that is think about how the borders treats immigrants at the moment. Might be something to consider in Ireland and indeed in the UK.
And indeed in the EU.
And indeed in the EU, absolutely.
But, Salil, if I can come on to that, I don't think we can think of borders as sort of static institutions which are there in themselves, like in terms of what do they protect, etc. I think ultimately borders depend upon who's running the countries on both sides. And some are easier, some can become softer in easier terms, and some seem more permanent. And some become totally irrelevant, they are sold as souvenirs, but some stay on. And frankly, you talked of the gender experience. I just didn't want to finish that off here, because in terms of the abducted people, I don't know how many people in this audience know that a lot of the women who were left on both sides didn't want to go back. They didn't want to go back because they thought their families may not accept them anymore. So, these are things which go through generations and impact generations. I think at the moment, frankly, in our context, the border's protecting it's just protecting territorial integrity. Because if you didn't have a very well-guarded border, we are under terrorist threat. And that is something which, you know something about that.
Well, indeed, I mean, Ireland's border gets a lot of bad press, but then there's a lot of folks to whom it is key to their identity, and to whom it is perhaps even almost sacred. And that we need to remember that this is not just some sort of again, internationally, and again, because of Brexit, I get a few interviews and things, people ring me up from different places, and this idea of the border as injustice has sold quite well internationally, I find. And so the first thing I usually have to say is, actually, it's got a lot of fans. And sometimes, even when you're blowing up a bridge, you're doing it to protect people. That's often how it happens.
That made it sound as if that's something that you go out regularly to do, blow up
Not
bridges.
me personally. I just mean the sort of bridge as positive metaphor and wall as negative. It doesn't break down that way. And I say, well, it just depends, how you feel.
No, it is context specific, but I mean, in that particular case, it was a bridge that did unite the Croat part with the Bosniak part in Mostar. And that's exactly why that colonel decided that we've been together, we have to be separate, and we have to be part of Croatia and not part of Bosnia. And which is the reason they decided to go ahead with it and break it. And then it was rebuilt finally.
And I think ultimately it depends upon why those border came to be.
Yeah.
You see, the bitterness comes from why and how that border was made.
Yeah.
If it is something natural with mutual agreement, there's going to be no bitterness, there's going to be no negativity. If it is something which is imposed, if there is some injustice seen in its very formation, then that's where the conflict is going to be. That's why people are going to feel bad being on this side or that side. And that's where you have to see the kind of conflict that occurred during, like in our India-Pakistan case, or in the Middle East, or if it was a peaceable sort of arrangement.
So I have one question about the agency of the communities. I mean, we spoke earlier about, the Sykes-Picot, and we spoke about Cyprus, Palestine, and so on, where yes, there was a colonial power, there was an administrative power which decided to carve out this place, like Curzon, looking at Bengal, going back to 1905 in a way, and that's the way he treats it. But surely we don't want to absolve the people of their responsibility for taking the borders as given, and then turning violent towards the people who are the next door neighbors. What breeds that kind of hatred?
Well, if you're asking
it's for everyone, and I don't have an answer. There's no right answer.
No, well, because ultimately, when the India-Pakistan border was created, a line was drawn through Punjab and Bengal, and people suddenly became minority in their area. There was violence, there was counter-violence, and then people had to move. And then all the sort of basic ills of human nature came to the fore. There was looting, there was murder, there was rape, there was fanaticism. But that's what in this book of short stories, Savage Harvest, and that's where the hope is. There's in the middle of the worst kind of barbarism, there was hope, because there was humanity, irrespective of religion.
Yeah, there's a story that I was thinking of during the session earlier on today, which was about, there was a period, I think it was in the late 1980s, where there was a lot of murders going on in what was known as the murder triangle of South Armagh, north, around Tyrone there, along the border, and it was both Loyalists and IRA who were carrying out, but at a certain stage there was a phase of Loyalist killings. And in fact, I found a line in one of your stories which reminded me of something that somebody said to me in one of those villages, which was that she said the day after this particular family had been all killed in their house, people didn't recognize each other because their whole appearance had been transformed by fear. And I found it in one of your stories in relation to another quite a similar situation of terror. But anyway, this is it was a massacre called the King's Mills Massacre, and what happened was these workmen were in a van driving home from work in a factory, and it was stopped by what appeared to be a military checkpoint. And because there had been a lot of killings of Catholics, they kind of assumed that that was what it was. And the gunmen, when they called them out of the van, said, okay, all the Catholics step forward. And two men called the Chapman Brothers, I can't remember what their first names were at the moment, but they knew that the man who was beside them was the only Catholic who was on the bus, and they sort of reached out their hands on either side of him and sort of gently pulled him back, as if to say, it's okay, you're among friends, don't identify yourself. And it turned out that in fact the killers were Republicans, and they identified the Catholic, told him to run and clear off, and then they killed all the Protestants, although one man survived as witness to the whole thing. But it was just that gesture of humanity that always stuck in my mind, yes, that they were willing to protect their friend even in this terrible circumstance in which it looked as if by doing so they might be risking their own lives. Those two brothers were both killed in that slaughter. But those gestures of humanity turn up again and again throughout stories of inhumanity, don't they? Where people distinguish themselves by doing things which are selfless and incredible.
Can we have the lights in the hall maybe? We have about 8 minutes. We can take a few questions if you keep them short and direct them specifically to a speaker. And
find it
do
very
keep them short so that we can take at least 3 or 4 questions. I see the gentleman here.
Humankind has existed on the brink. Therein lies a modicum of hope. So for you guys, what gives you hope for the future?
Well, I was a friend of Lyra McKay, who's a young journalist who was murdered recently in my city of Derry, and she was a young LGBT woman who spoke very movingly about the need to hope, the requirement to hope. That because she said that sometimes that's the only thing that young gay people have, is the hope that things will change and get better. And she was talking in the context of the way that a lot of young gay people were killing themselves. So I think, and when she was killed herself, I sort of thought of the lines from Seamus Heaney, when he talks about hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. And I realise that when he says that, he doesn't mean, be optimistic or, try to be cheerful or whatever. He's actually instructing us that we must hope, that it's an imperative. So I think it's a very difficult thing to do sometimes, but, a lot of people in Ireland have despaired of Irish politics, and then you're just relinquishing any chance of influencing anything for change.
Do you have any thought after? Who says you have to have hope? I don't. I mean, I try. I don't know, I think these are dark days, though. There's work to do. I wouldn't. I would hope there's this kind of a sense of purpose, not just me, but in general. And indeed, in conversations like this, that kind of purpose can be acted out. I try to have hope. But these do feel like quite dark times, I work in Queen's University, and we get these things called disability memos if students have issues of one sort or another. So you help them out. So if they're in a wheelchair, then obviously that will dictate where you teach a class, for example. But the vast majority of them are about mental health. And there are so many of them. It's really like an epidemic. And of course, it's a worrying world. It feels that way. And they got more to worry about than me. So, yeah, hope. I'm working on it. Conversations like these are good, and we should continue them outside. And yeah, you have to hope, I suppose, as we've just heard. But we have to work more.
Can I just build on it while others think of a question? Is this whole idea about how to deal with the past? There are 2 forms of justice, the retributive and the restorative.
Yeah.
Retributing, have an international crimes tribunal, prosecute the person, punish the person without the death penalty, but punish them as they are doing it in The Hague, for example.
Yeah.
That's one. And the restorative one is the way gacaca courts have come about, particularly in the context of the Rwanda conflict, where you have some way of atonement, where communities talk to each other and a kind of healing process begins. It doesn't have to be either or, because Rwanda is a very good example where Arusha is a tribunal and gacaca is a restorative model. Do you think such measures are necessary? Because one of the things that people in South Africa and Bangladesh have told me in my work is that, we can do that, but before you can forgive, someone has to express remorse first. So I just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Well, those kind of tribunals you're talking about internationally, I think do have a vital role as almost a ritualistic sort of taking things out into the light. In Ireland, it seems to me there's a position for that as well, of course. And indeed there's things like Soldier F and whatnot are our sort of version of it. But there's also, it's an important too that we take our own responsibility. But that's part of the work, I suppose, that we're able to take our own responsibility for it. Now with Brexit coming at us, there is a lot of talk sort of blaming people in Westminster, and it's sort of
it's the Oxford. According to Simon Cooper in Financial Times today, the whole fault lies with Oxford in 1980s.
Yeah, well,
yes.
It's an interesting reckoning with UK and its sort of upper classes has been acted out in Brexit. Yeah, but I think mostly here it's about taking our own responsibility for things. And another thing that's emerged with Brexit is a kind of I've even heard this phrase quite a lot. It's not Ireland's border, it's Britain's border in Ireland.
In Ireland, that's right.
Like
yeah.
it's this imposed, it's that imposed story of narrative of history. And there's something to it. But actually, I think we've proven ourselves well capable of building our own borders. And it would be actually empowering and even hopeful if we absorb that responsibility and work from there.
Yeah, Navtej, you wanted to
No,
comment?
I just wanted to say you're talking of what sort of memory should we have and what is for. I think ultimately, I don't believe that forgetting is either possible or advisable. But that, I think the maturity of a society lies in remembering with responsibility.
Right.
So you don't remember for revenge, but you remember so that this doesn't happen again. And so we don't go back, we don't become wild men again if a similar situation arises. So I think that's the way I would teach history if I had to teach the history of Indian partition, is to look, this is what happened and this is why it happened. Because the British did what they did, but then it's ultimately, you guys killed each other. So how do we get into a space where if that similar thing were to happen, we wouldn't end up doing the same thing again?
If I could just say very quickly.
1 minute left, so one last question, but do go on very quickly.
Just very quick, I just want to say that sentiment that Navtej just expressed is one I hear a lot on the border. It's remember history so you don't repeat it. That's often you hear that phrase.
Before I end, and this is on healing, again, on going back to the Mostar Bridge, I just thought I'll read out something from Michael Ignatieff and my response to it. There is really no way back to the old bridge, Ignatieff writes, just as there is no way back to the way Mostar was before the madness came. How do you build bridges between people? How do you help people to heal? In Berlin, the people tore down a wall, but many residents said the wall in the mind remained. In Mostar, the people have rebuilt the bridge now, but the chasm remains. On my last night in Mostar, as the sky darkened and the starlit night glowed, we saw its silhouette. The scaffolding no longer dominated the image, and it was still possible to see the fragile beauty of what Bosnia-Herzegovina used to be like. Once wounded, heavily bandaged, the bridge was together again. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a lovely, beautiful session. Thank you, Garrett.